On June the 9th, 1944, 3 days after the largest invasion fleet ever assembled had come ashore on the beaches of Normandy, a message reached the headquarters of the German High Command in Berlin. It came from one of the Abwehr's most trusted agents in Britain, a man the Germans knew as Alaric, whose reports had been landing on the desks of German military intelligence for nearly 2 years, each one judged more reliable than the last. The message said, in careful, urgent language, that the landings already underway in Normandy were a diversion. The real invasion, it insisted, had not happened yet. It was still coming, aimed at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest crossing of the English Channel, and every German division held in reserve there should stay exactly where it was. Adolf Hitler's own headquarters read the message and believed it. 22 German divisions stayed put at Calais for weeks, waiting for an invasion that would never come, while the real one bled for its life on the beaches 150 miles away, its outcome still very much undecided. The man who sent that message had never fired a shot in anger in his entire life, had never set foot on British soil until the British themselves smuggled him there against his own government's wishes, and had built the spy network the Germans trusted more than almost any other source in the country, entirely out of library books, railway timetables, and his own patient, methodical imagination. This is the story of a man who helped decide the most important battle of the Second World War using nothing but a fictional intelligence network, a wife who very nearly exposed him by accident, and a talent for turning his own limitations into evidence of his brilliance. By the spring of 1944, Allied planners understood exactly how much was riding on the deception succeeding. A landing at Normandy that met the full weight of German reserves already positioned nearby stood a genuine chance of failing outright, of becoming a second Dieppe, the catastrophic 1942 raid that had cost thousands of Allied lives against far weaker defenses than the ones now waiting in France. Every week we take apart a moment when a war turned, the people who made it happen, and the razor-thin margin between disaster and victory. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. Juan Pujol Garcia was born in Barcelona on February the 14th, 1912, the third of 4 children in a liberal, comfortably middle-class family, the son of a Catalan industrialist whose own ethical convictions would shape his son's decisions for the rest of his life. His formal education produced exactly one credential, a diploma from the Royal Poultry School, the most prestigious chicken farming school in Spain, and a spectacularly unlikely launching point for the career that would follow it. When the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, Pujol wanted no part of either side's ideology, hiding from conscription by the Republican forces, before finally being caught and pressed into their ranks. He deserted at the first opportunity and made his way to the nationalist side instead, where he came to despise the fascism there just as thoroughly as he had despised the communism on the other side of the line. By his own later account, he took a strange pride in one specific fact about those years, that he had managed to serve, in one uniform or another, on both sides of a brutal civil war without ever once firing his weapon at another human being. After the war, settled in Madrid with his wife, Araceli Gonzalez, whom he had met in Burgos during the fighting, Pujol decided he wanted to contribute something to what he called the good of humanity once the larger war in Europe began. He had no formal skills a spy service might want, no military intelligence background, no language beyond his own, no contacts inside any government. What he had was a settled conviction that Britain was the only country still standing squarely against the fascism he had already learned to hate, and a willingness to simply walk up to the British and offer his services directly. In 1941, Pujol approached the British embassy in Madrid and asked to be recruited as a spy. He was turned away, dismissed as an amateur with nothing concrete to offer. He tried again some weeks later, receiving even less patience than the first time. He sent Araceli in his place on the theory that a woman might receive a warmer welcome, and the British embassy rebuffed her just as completely as they had rebuffed him. 3 separate attempts, 3 separate rejections. From an intelligence service that would spend the rest of the war grateful, it eventually changed its mind. Undeterred, and reasoning that the surest way to eventually prove his value to the British was to first make himself useful to their enemy, Pujol walked into the German embassy in Madrid instead and offered his services to the Abwehr. The Germans, seeing exactly the kind of eager, ideologically motivated amateur they were always looking for, recruited him on the spot and gave him the code name Alaric. His instructions were simple: travel to Britain, recruit a network of sub-agents, report back on troop movements, military production, and anything else of value he could gather. The German government had reason to be pleased with what it believed it had recruited. Wartime Spain, nominally neutral but riddled with Axis sympathizers in its own diplomatic and military establishment, gave the Abwehr an easy channel through which to run agents into Britain. And a volunteer who arrived already fluent in the right ideological language fit the profile of a reliable asset almost too well. Pujol did not travel to Britain. He had a forged diplomatic document that let him settle instead in neutral Lisbon, and from a rented room in a country he had no ability to actually observe London or the English countryside from, he began inventing an entire SPY network out of thin air. He built his reports from British tourist guides, railway timetables, magazine advertisements, and newsreels playing in Lisbon's cinemas describing troop movements and military installations he had only ever read about in a public library. He invented sub-agents scattered across the country, sailors, disaffected officials, a fictional network eventually numbering in the dozens, each one a persona he sustained entirely through correspondence with a German intelligence service that had no way to verify any of it from occupied Europe. His command of British geography and culture was shaky enough that some of what he sent back was almost comically wrong, describing Scotsmen who would supposedly do anything for a liter of wine, in a country where wine was neither the local drink of choice nor particularly available under wartime rationing. None of it mattered. The Germans, eager for exactly the kind of confirmation his reports offered, accepted every word without meaningful scrutiny. The turning point came almost by accident. One of Pujol's invented sub-agents supposedly reported on a British convoy sailing from Liverpool, details that were entirely fabricated. British codebreakers monitoring German traffic intercepted the Abwehr's own excited internal messages about this convoy and launched a real, resource-intensive search for a ship that had never existed. The hunt for a phantom informant convinced British intelligence that something inside their own system needed urgent attention, and combined with a second approach Araceli made this time to an American naval attaché in Lisbon, willing to actually listen to her story, it finally brought Pujol to the attention of an intelligence service that had rejected him outright only months earlier. In April of 1942, British intelligence officers in Lisbon interviewed him properly for the first time and arranged for Pujol and his pregnant wife to be smuggled out through Gibraltar to England. He arrived in Plymouth with almost no English, having never previously set foot in the country he had already been reporting on in exhaustive, fabricated detail for the better part of a year, and MI5 gave him a new code name to match the very different service he would now be performing. Garbo, named for a man his handlers considered the best actor in the world. The broader system Pujol now belonged to had a name and an origin story of its own. Every German agent who parachuted or sailed into wartime Britain in the war's early years had, with almost no exceptions, been captured within days, and each was offered the same stark choice: cooperate with British intelligence or be executed as a spy. Most chose cooperation, and the network of turned agents that resulted was overseen by a body called the 20 Committee, so named for the Roman numeral 20, itself a play on the double cross the entire system represented, run by John Masterman, a former Oxford academic who had spent 4 years as a prisoner of war in Germany during the First World War. Pujol was, by near universal agreement of the committee that oversaw him, the most talented and productive of them all, precisely because he required almost no real material to work with. That handler was Thomas Harris, a bilingual art dealer turned intelligence officer who would spend the next 2 years working almost daily alongside Pujol, helping him formalize and dramatically expand the fictional network he had built alone in Lisbon. Under Harris's guidance, the invented subagent network grew to 27 distinct personas, each with a name, a background, a plausible reason for access to whatever intelligence he was supposedly gathering. Together they communicated in hundreds of letters and eventually over 500 radio messages sent to German intelligence between January and June of 1944 alone, averaging roughly 4 transmissions a day. When the fiction required it, Pujol and Harris killed off subagents who had become inconvenient, planting fabricated obituaries in British newspapers and watching with a mixture of relief and dark amusement as German handlers sent formal condolences to the grieving widows of men who had never existed at all. None of this fictional empire came without real cost at home, and the closest the entire operation ever came to collapsing had nothing to do with German suspicion or any failure in the elaborate fiction Pujol and Harris had built. It came from an increasingly isolated woman in a house in Harrow, northwest London, who had not asked for any of this. Araceli spoke no English. She had left her family, her country, and everything familiar to follow a husband who now spent nearly every waking hour with his handler rather than with her, confined to their home for security reasons, explained to her only in the vaguest terms. By the summer of 1943, homesick and increasingly desperate for contact with the family she had left behind in Spain, she threatened to go to the Spanish embassy in London and expose the entire operation unless she was allowed to visit her mother, a demand that MI5's own surviving files would later describe in stark terms that her anger had brought the entire double-cross system to the edge of catastrophe over a domestic grievance no amount of strategic planning had accounted for. Pujol and his handlers managed to defuse the crisis, and Araceli remained in England, still isolated for the remainder of the war, her own contribution to the operation's success measured not in reports or radio messages, but in a single moment when she very nearly and understandably brought the entire structure down. By early 1944, Pujol's fictional network had become one of the load-bearing pillars of Operation Fortitude. The broader Allied deception campaign meant to convince German intelligence that the coming invasion of France would land at the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Working from within the 20 Committee, Pujol and Harris fed German intelligence a steady, carefully paced diet of reports describing a fictional army, the first United States Army group supposedly massing in southeast England under General George Patton, more than a dozen divisions of men and equipment that existed only as dummy radio traffic and staged troop movements photographed from angles calculated to fool German aerial reconnaissance. Dummy landing craft, built from wood and canvas over steel frames, floated in English harbors specifically positioned to be photographed by German reconnaissance aircraft. Inflatable rubber tanks, light enough for a handful of soldiers to reposition by hand overnight, gave aerial photographs the impression of armored divisions where none actually existed. The goal was never simply to hide where the real invasion would land. It was to convince the Germans that even after a landing occurred somewhere else, the truly decisive blow was still coming at Calais, and that whatever they saw happening on any given morning should be read as a feint rather than the main event. On the morning of June 6, 1944, as Allied troops came ashore at Normandy under the code name Operation Overlord, Pujol transmitted a message to his German handlers that appeared on its surface to be exactly the kind of advance warning a trusted agent should have provided, a report describing troop movements consistent with an imminent invasion, timed so carefully that it would not actually reach Berlin until after the landings were already underway. The apparent near miss, a warning that arrived just late enough to be useless, only reinforced his credibility with German intelligence rather than damaging it, evidence as far as the Abwehr was concerned of a diligent agent working under difficult wartime communication conditions rather than a fabrication engineered down to the hour by two men who understood exactly how much benefit of the doubt a trusted source could still expect to receive even after appearing to fail at the one job that actually mattered. It was the message 3 days later on June the 9th that mattered more than anything Pujol had sent before it, And it was also, by any reasonable measure, the single riskiest transmission of his entire career, sent at the exact moment when the surest path to safety for any real double agent would have been silence, rather than a bold, specific, checkable claim. With Allied forces already fighting their way inland from the Normandy beaches, with the actual invasion no longer a matter of speculation, but of daily newspaper headlines reaching German intelligence through a dozen other channels entirely outside Pujol's control, he transmitted his assessment directly through channels that reached Hitler's own military staff, that the Normandy landings were a large-scale diversion designed to draw German reserves away from the true invasion still to come at the Pièce de Calais. It was, on its face, an almost absurd claim to make about an invasion the entire world could already see unfolding on the radio and in the newspapers. It worked anyway. German High Command, having spent 2 years coming to trust Alaric's network as one of its most reliable sources inside Britain, held its 15th Army and roughly 22 divisions at the Pas de Calais for weeks after D-Day, waiting for a second invasion that existed only in the fictional order of Battle Pujol, and Harris had spent 2 years constructing one carefully worded radio message at a time. By the time German commanders fully accepted that no second landing was coming, the Allied position in Normandy had hardened past the point where those reserves could have changed the outcome, even if they had moved immediately and without hesitation the moment doubt finally set in. Historians who have studied the deception since have generally credited it with saving thousands of Allied lives and meaningfully shortening the battle for Normandy, holding in place a force that, redirected in the invasion's first critical days, could plausibly have thrown the entire landing back into the sea before it ever secured a lasting foothold on French soil. None of it required a single shot fired by the man responsible for it. Pujol's contribution to the most consequential amphibious invasion in modern history was, in the most literal sense available, entirely a work of fiction, sustained by library books, forged letters, invented deaths, and roughly 2 years of near-daily correspondence with an enemy that never once managed to catch him in the lie, despite having every institutional resource of the Third Reich's own intelligence apparatus theoretically available to check his claims against reality. The recognition that followed was almost as strange as the deception itself. In July of 1944, the German government awarded Alaric the Iron Cross, second class, for his exceptional service to the Reich, a decoration personally recommended, according to later research, all the way up through Hitler's own military intelligence apparatus, still entirely convinced they were honoring one of their most valuable assets in Britain, a source whose network of 27 devoted informants had, in the Abwehr's own internal assessment, more than earned the honor. Later that same year, King George VI appointed Juan Pujol Garcia a member of the Order of the British Empire for services that could not, for reasons of ongoing secrecy, be publicly described for decades afterward, an honor awarded quietly and without ceremony to a man whose actual achievements would remain classified long after most of the men he had helped defeat were already dead. He remains one of a vanishingly small number of people decorated by both sides of the Second World War, each government fully convinced right up to the war's end, and well beyond it in Germany's case, that it was rewarding a man loyal only to itself. After the war, Pujol had a final practical problem to solve: the very real possibility that former Nazis or German intelligence veterans, learning eventually that Alaric had been a British asset the entire time, might come looking for him or his family in retribution. With MI5's help, he arranged to fake his own death from malaria in Angola in 1949, a quiet, undramatic exit from a life that had spent years depending on exactly this kind of carefully engineered fiction, disappearing from the historical record almost as completely as the 27 sub-agents he had once invented and then killed off on paper. He resurfaced only decades later in 1984 at the invitation of a historian researching the double-cross system who had tracked him down through old intelligence contacts and traveled to London for the 40th anniversary of D-Day, where he was received by the Queen and reunited, briefly and quietly with the intelligence establishment that had once turned him away 3 times before ever taking him seriously. He settled afterward in Venezuela, living quietly under his own name for the rest of his life, and died in Caracas on October the 10th, 1988, 74 years old, having spent nearly 4 decades as a man the wider world believed had already died in a jungle hospital 40 years before he actually did. This is not a story about a spy who was better than everyone else at gathering intelligence. Pujol never actually gathered any real intelligence at all, not once in his entire career. He never surveilled a British airfield, never photographed a single document, never recruited an actual informant with genuine access to anything. It is a story about a man who understood more completely than almost anyone else in the war that the people receiving a report were often more invested in believing it than in checking it, and that a fiction assembled patiently enough from tourist guides and railway timetables and invented obituaries could carry more weight in the mind of a desperate, overstretched intelligence service than the truth ever could have. German intelligence officers reading Alaric's reports were not fools. They were professionals operating under wartime pressure, hungry for exactly the kind of confirmation that told them their own strategic assumptions were correct. And Pujol, without ever setting foot in the country he claimed to be watching, understood that hunger better than the men feeling it did themselves. Somewhere in the German military archives, buried among thousands of wartime intelligence assessments, now studied mostly by historians rather than analysts, the original Iron Cross citation for a British agent still describes exactly what its authors believed they were rewarding: loyal, indispensable service to the Reich, delivered by a network of nearly 30 devoted informants scattered across wartime Britain, men and women who had supposedly risked their lives for the German cause across 2 years of dangerous clandestine work. Not one of those informants ever existed. Every name, every backstory, every reported death, and every grieving fictional widow was the invention of 2 men working from a house in Harrow in a handler's office in London, sustained by nothing more solid than careful handwriting, patient research, and an enemy that wanted, more than it wanted the truth, to believe its own network was as good as it had always assumed it was. Somewhere in a different archive entirely, in the British National Archives in Kew, the actual surviving files on Agent Garbo record a second, quieter story that took decades to become public at all. A homesick woman in a house in Harrow, whose single threatened visit to an embassy came closer to unraveling fortitude than any German counterintelligence officer ever did, her name appearing in official assessments, not as a footnote, but as a genuine, documented point of failure in one of the most consequential deception operations of the entire war. The man who invented every single one of those 27 informants never fired a weapon in the Spanish Civil War that first taught him how to survive inside a conflict without joining it, never gathered a genuine piece of military intelligence in his life, and helped hold 22 German divisions in exactly the wrong place at exactly the moment it mattered most, using nothing sharper than a library card. A patient wife who very nearly ended it all out of simple loneliness and his own relentless, methodical imagination. If you want more stories about the people who quietly decided the outcome of a war without ever raising a weapon, subscribe, and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.